Every head in coach turned as the screaming pierced through Flight 447. Two babies, crying in perfect, agonizing harmony. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, shooting glares toward seat 23C, where James Norris clutched his 6-month-old twins like they were the only things keeping him upright. Amara wailed against his chest, her face purple with hunger. Malik shrieked from the carrier dangling off his other arm. James tried to shush them, bouncing desperately, but nothing worked. The bottle wasn't working. Amara kept spitting out the nipple, her cries becoming more desperate, more primal with each second. An older woman across the aisle pulled on noise-canceling headphones and glared at him with pure disgust. Someone from 12B muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Can't he control them?" James felt his chest tighten, felt every eye burning into him with that same judgment. Another incompetent black father. 3 hours of sleep in 2 days. His mama fighting pneumonia in a hospital bed back in Atlanta. A life-changing interview waiting for him in Denver in just 4 hours. And now this, public humiliation at 30,000 feet with nowhere to hide. Then something impossible happened. Heels clicked up the aisle from first class, sharp, purposeful, cutting through the chaos. A young white woman in a cream blazer and pearl necklace appeared beside his seat, her eyes locked on screaming Amara with an intensity that made James freeze. She didn't ask if she could help. She studied his daughter's purple face, listened to that desperate hunger cry, and said something that made James's heart stop. "She's hungry. I just had my baby 4 months ago. I'm still nursing. If you're comfortable, I can help." The cabin went silent. Every passenger within earshot turned to stare. James's mind went blank, torn between crushing pride and desperate need. This white woman, this stranger in expensive jewelry, was offering to breastfeed his black daughter on a commercial airplane in front of 150 witnesses. When he finally managed to nod, unable to form words, she gently lifted Amara from his arms, sat down, and discreetly draped a blanket. Within seconds, the screaming stopped. Just stopped. The entire plane fell into shocked, breathless silence. James sat, frozen, watching his daughter nurse peacefully from this stranger's breast, and felt everything crash into him at once. Relief, shame, gratitude, confusion, exposure. A black flight attendant approached with tears streaming down her face. "Sir," she whispered, voice breaking, "that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on a plane." But James also saw the other faces. Judgment, curiosity, some passengers with phones subtly raised, recording this intimate moment. He had never felt more vulnerable in his entire life. He didn't know this woman's name. He didn't know why she'd helped. And he definitely didn't know that by the time they landed in Denver, his entire world would be turned upside down. Because this mysterious woman in first class wasn't just a kind stranger helping a struggling father. She was the young CEO of the company he was flying to interview with. And what happened on that plane would force both of them to confront everything about race, privilege, vulnerability, and what it truly means to show up for another human being when the whole world is watching. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, hit that like button and subscribe, because what unfolds next will challenge everything you think you know about compassion across impossible divides. And I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. Amara's breathing had finally settled into the soft rhythm of a satisfied baby, her tiny fist curled against the blanket draped over Catherine's shoulder. James sat rigid in his seat, unable to look away, unable to process what was happening. Around them, the plane had returned to its normal hum, conversations, laptop keyboards clicking, the drink cart rattling down the aisle, but their little corner felt suspended in something else entirely. "Thank you," James finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, too small for what this stranger had just done. Catherine looked up at him with those calm blue eyes, and for the first time he noticed how young she really was. Late 20s, maybe 30 at most. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I know what it's like to be desperate." Before James could respond, Malik started fussing in his carrier. Catherine glanced down at the baby boy, then back at James with a knowing look. "May I?" she asked, already shifting Amara to one arm with practiced ease. James nodded, still unable to form full sentences. He lifted Malik out, and Catherine took him just as naturally as she'd taken his sister, repositioning the blanket. Within moments, Malik's cries faded too, replaced by that same peaceful silence that felt like a miracle. "I was 16 when I got pregnant," Catherine said suddenly, her voice steady but distant, like she was speaking to the past. "My parents had money, lots of it. Big house in Sacramento, country club memberships, the whole thing. When I told them, my father gave me two choices, abortion or the street." She paused, her jaw tightening. "I chose the street." James felt something shift in his chest, his assumptions crumbling like sand. "I ended up in a shelter downtown," Catherine continued, her fingers absently stroking Malik's head. 20 beds crammed into one room, shared bathroom, rules about everything. I was terrified. I didn't know anything about being a mother, didn't know how I'd survive. And then this woman, Mrs. Lorraine Washington, she ran a small cleaning business, came to the shelter looking for workers. She was black, maybe 60 years old, with these hands that had seen decades of hard work. Catherine's eyes got distant, lost in the memory. She took one look at my pregnant belly and said, "Baby girl, you got skills?" I told her I could organize anything, that I was good with numbers. She hired me on the spot, let me work around my pregnancy appointments. After my daughter was born, she'd bring me to jobs, let me keep the baby in an office while I worked. She taught me everything about running a business, how to bid jobs, manage money, treat people right. James found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. When my daughter was 3 months old, Mrs. Washington sat me down and said she was getting too old for the work. She wanted to retire. She offered to sell me the business for exactly what I'd saved, $12,000. Everyone told her I was too young, too white, too inexperienced to make it in that industry. Catherine's voice cracked slightly. But she looked me in the eye and said, "I don't see a white girl who made mistakes. I see a mother who's fighting for her baby. That's all that matters." The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, and Catherine instinctively tightened her hold on Malik. James watched her, seeing something in her face he recognized, that fierce, protective love that made you willing to sacrifice anything. "She saved my life," Catherine whispered. She didn't see color or judgment or some cautionary tale. She just saw someone who needed help, and she gave it. She looked directly at James then, her eyes holding his. "So when I see a father on a plane at 4 in the morning, running on empty, trying to hold it all together by himself, I don't see a statistic or a headline. I see someone fighting. And if I can help, I will." James felt his throat tighten, felt all his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. His pride was screaming at him. What does she want? What's the angle? Nobody helps like this without expecting something back, but looking at her face, at the genuine compassion there, he couldn't find the cynicism to hold on to. "Why are you going to Denver?" he asked, needing to shift the conversation away from the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Catherine's expression changed instantly, something dark and painful flickering across her features before she could mask it. Her hand moved unconsciously to a simple gold band on her right ring finger, twisting it once, twice. "I'm visiting someone," she said quietly, her voice suddenly hollow. "Someone I lost." The way she said it made James's stomach drop. There was a story there, something raw and unhealed, but before he could ask, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we've got some weather ahead over Kansas. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare for moderate turbulence." Catherine glanced out the window at the dark clouds gathering in the distance, and James saw her face go pale. Her hands, which had been so steady while holding his babies, suddenly started trembling. Whatever was waiting for them in those clouds, it wasn't just the weather she was afraid of. The first jolt hit without warning. The plane dropped, then bucked violently to the left. Overhead, compartments rattled. Someone screamed. The cabin lights flickered as the aircraft shuddered through the storm, and in that instant, Catherine's entire body transformed. She curved forward over both babies, Amara still in her arms, Malik in his carrier at her feet, creating a shield with her own frame. Her hands went white-knuckled on the armrests, her breathing rapid and shallow. James reached out instinctively. "Hey, it's okay. It's just—" Another violent drop cut him off. The plane felt like it was falling from the sky. Coffee cups crashed to the floor. A woman 2 rows up was crying. But James wasn't looking at any of that. He was staring at Catherine's face, at the absolute terror written there, something far deeper than fear of turbulence. This was primal. This was trauma. "Catherine," he said firmly, touching her shoulder, "look at me. The babies are okay. You're okay." But she wasn't okay. Tears were streaming down her face, her whole body shaking even as she kept herself locked protectively over the twins. The plane bucked again, and she let out a sound, half sob, half gasp, that made James's chest ache. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't do this again. I can't—" "Can't do what?" James moved closer, his voice low and urgent. "Talk to me." The turbulence began to ease, the plane leveling out, but Catherine's panic wasn't subsiding. If anything, she was shaking harder. James gently took Amara from her arms, placed his daughter back in her carrier, then turned back to Catherine. She was curled into herself now, that polished CEO composure completely shattered. 15 years ago today," she whispered, her voice so broken it barely carried. "I killed my son." The words hung in the air like smoke. James froze, not knowing what to say, how to respond. His name was Michael. He was 3 years old. Catherine's hands were pressed against her face now, tears leaking through her fingers. "I was driving him to daycare, running late, as always. My phone rang. It was a client, a big account, and I thought I could just answer quickly. Just handle it, just—" Her voice cracked completely. "I looked down at the phone for 5 seconds, maybe less. When I looked up, there was a truck stopped at the light. I hit the brakes, but—" She couldn't finish, didn't need to. James felt his stomach turn to ice. "He died in the ambulance," Catherine continued, her voice mechanical now, like she'd told this story so many times it had worn grooves in her soul. "I was so focused on work, on building the business Mrs. Washington gave me, on proving I could make it, that I took my eyes off the road, off my baby, and he paid the price for my ambition." James reached out without thinking, putting his hand on her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Every year on this day, I fly to Denver. That's where we lived. That's where he's buried at Crown Hill Cemetery. I sit at his grave, and I tell him I'm sorry. I tell him about all the mothers I've helped, all the babies I've fed when parents were desperate, all the times I've tried to save someone else's child since I couldn't save my own." Her eyes met James's, red and raw. "It doesn't make it better. Nothing makes it better. But helping people like you, seeing babies like yours survive when mine didn't, it's the only thing that makes the guilt bearable." Even for just a moment. The cabin had gone quiet around them, the turbulence passed. But James felt like he was still falling, his entire understanding of this woman reshaping itself. This wasn't charity. This wasn't white saviorism. This was a mother trying to atone for an impossible loss by making sure other mothers, other fathers, didn't have to face their worst moments alone. "I'm so sorry," James said, and meant it more deeply than any apology he'd ever given. Catherine wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. "Don't be sorry. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never take your eyes off them." Her gaze dropped to the twins, both sleeping peacefully now, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed, both the literal one and the emotional one. Not for work, not for money, not for anything. Because I have to live with the fact that I chose a phone call over my child's life. And that's a weight nobody should carry. James felt his throat close up, thinking about his interview waiting in Denver, about how desperately he needed that job, about all the times he'd been so stressed and exhausted that he'd put the twins in front of a screen just to get 5 minutes of peace. He looked at Amara and Malik, really looked at them, and felt something shift deep in his chest. "I promise," he whispered. Catherine nodded, then straightened up, visibly trying to reassemble her composure. She pulled out a compact mirror, wiped away the mascara stains. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, that CEO mask sliding back into place. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I usually handle the anniversary better." "Don't apologize. Thank you for telling me." James paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "What's the company? The one you built?" Catherine hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Plain white, elegant typography. She handed it to James without a word. He looked down at the card and felt his entire world tilt on its axis. Because printed there, in simple black letters, was the name he'd been obsessing over for 3 weeks. The name that represented his last chance, his way out, his future. Meridian Logistics. Catherine Owen, founder and CEO. James looked up at her, his mouth dry, his mind racing. She was the CEO. The woman who'd just breastfed his babies, who'd shared her darkest trauma, who'd shown him more vulnerability and compassion than anyone in his life. She was the person who would be interviewing him in less than 3 hours. And from the way Catherine's expression shifted as she watched him read the card, she'd just realized exactly who he was, too. The plane touched down at Denver International at 6:15 a.m., wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a bump. Around them, passengers immediately jumped up, grabbing bags from overhead compartments. But James sat frozen in seat 23C, the business card still in his hand, Catherine Owen sitting beside him, in silence that felt like static electricity. Neither of them had spoken since the recognition. What was there to say? Every word felt loaded, dangerous. Catherine stood first, smoothing her blazer with those efficient hands. When she reached for his diaper bag under the seat, James wanted to protest, wanted to maintain some dignity, but she was already organizing the scattered bottles and pacifiers like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Let me help you," she said quietly. And it wasn't a question. James nodded, unable to form words. He watched as she adjusted the twin carriers on his chest, showing him how to distribute the weight more evenly so his back wouldn't scream by the time he reached the terminal. Her hands moved with practiced competence, professional but not cold, and James felt that same confusion from earlier. Was this the CEO helping a candidate, or was this still just Catherine, the mother who understood? "There," she said, stepping back. "That's better." They moved through the jetway in silence, through the terminal's bright corridors where everything smelled like coffee and recycled air. James kept waiting for her to say something about the interview, about what happened on the plane, about the impossible situation they'd just stumbled into. But Catherine walked beside him without speaking, and somehow that felt right. Some things were too big for words. At baggage claim, she finally stopped. From her purse, she pulled out a blank white card, no logo, no title, and wrote something quickly before handing it to him. Just Catherine and 7 digits. nothing else. "You're going to do great today," she said, meeting his eyes directly. There was no pity there, no corporate distance, just genuine belief. "Those babies are lucky to have you." Before James could respond, she squeezed his shoulder. Brief, warm, almost maternal. And then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Cream blazer vanishing among hundreds of early morning travelers like she'd been a dream he'd half imagined. James stood alone in the middle of baggage claim, twins asleep against his chest, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. Around him, people rushed past with purpose while he felt suspended, untethered. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Mama, how'd the flight go, baby?" James stared at the screen. How did he even begin to answer that? He typed, "It was fine. Babies slept most of the way." The lie felt necessary. The truth was too strange, too unfinished to share. He pocketed the phone and headed toward the exit, his mind racing. In 2.5 hours, he'd be sitting in a conference room at Meridian Logistics. And Catherine Owen, the woman who'd just nursed his children, who'd shared her darkest trauma, who'd shown him more vulnerability than anyone in his life, would be on the other side of that table. Would she pretend it never happened? Would she hold it against him? Would she think he'd manipulated the situation somehow? That he'd known who she was? The automatic doors opened to frigid Denver morning air. James took a breath, adjusted the twins, and stepped outside. A Blacktown car was pulling away from the terminal, and through the tinted back window, he caught a glimpse of silver blonde hair. The car turned west, away from the city center, toward Crown Hill Cemetery, and James realized with sudden, terrible clarity he was about to walk into the most important interview of his life. And the woman across the table would be visiting her dead son's grave on the anniversary of his death. She'd be raw, grieving, carrying 15 years of guilt and loss. And he'd be desperate, exhausted, carrying his own weight of shame and fear. What happened in that conference room wouldn't just decide his future. It would reveal whether what happened on Flight 447 was real grace, or just another transaction between people who needed something from each other. Meridian Logistics headquarters sat in the Denver Tech Center like a glass monument to success, all clean lines and reflective surfaces that caught the morning sun. James stood on the sidewalk at 8:45 a.m., twins strapped to his chest, staring up at the building that could save his life or confirm every fear he'd ever had about himself. His reflection in the glass doors showed exactly what he felt: exhausted, wrinkled, out of place. The navy button-down he'd ironed so carefully in Atlanta was creased from the flight. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a man barely holding it together, and that's exactly what he was. "You earned this position on your record," Catherine had said. But had he? Or had she already decided on that plane, watching him struggle, that he'd make a good charity case for her annual grief ritual? James pushed through the revolving doors into a lobby that screamed money. Marble floors, modern art on white walls, a reception desk that looked like it cost more than his car. Behind it sat a young black woman with box braids and a warm smile that reminded him of home. "Good morning. You must be Mr. Norris." She stood, and her eyes immediately went to the twins. "Oh, my goodness, they're precious." "Thank you," James managed, his voice rough. Amara was starting to stir against his chest. "How old are they?" The receptionist, her nameplate said Tiana, came around the desk, unable to resist getting closer. 6 months. They're perfect. Ms. Owen is going to love them. She's crazy about babies." Tiana's smile was genuine, unguarded. "I swear, every time someone brings a child into this office, she just lights up." James's stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. "Ms. Owen?" "Catherine Owen, our CEO." Tiana gestured toward a hallway lined with offices. "She conducts all executive-level interviews personally. She should be finishing up her previous meeting any minute now. Can I get you some coffee? Water?" I'm good, James lied, his mouth suddenly dry. His hands were starting to shake again, that familiar tremor he got when stress overwhelmed him. Catherine was here, in this building, right now. Of course she is, he thought bitterly. She owns the damn place. Your interview is in conference room A, Tiana continued, oblivious to James's internal crisis. Just down that hall, third door on the left, the glass one. You can't miss it. James nodded, forcing his feet to move. Each step down that polished hallway felt like walking toward judgment. The conference room appeared exactly where Tiana said, floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered no privacy, no hiding. Inside, he could see a long table, leather chairs, a presentation screen on the wall. He was 5 feet from the door when another door opened further down the hall. Catherine Owen stepped out. But this wasn't the woman from the plane. This wasn't Catherine in her cream blazer with tears on her face, nursing his babies under a blanket. This was the CEO, black Armani pantsuit that probably cost more than James made in a month, silver blonde hair styled with precision, diamond studs catching the light. Her face was composed, professional, untouchable. She was talking to someone behind her, giving instructions in a voice that commanded respect and expected obedience. Then she turned. Their eyes met across the lobby. For one brief second, James saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition, maybe concern, something human breaking through that corporate armor. But it vanished so quickly, he might have imagined it. Catherine's face went carefully neutral, and she walked toward him with the measured confidence of someone who owned every inch of space she occupied. "Mr. Norris," she said, extending her hand. Her voice was cordial, professional, like they'd never met before. Like she hadn't held his screaming children 4 hours ago. Like she hadn't confessed to killing her son while tears streamed down her face. "Welcome to Meridian Logistics. I'm Catherine Owen." James stared at her outstretched hand, his mind screaming. Was this really happening? Was she going to pretend the entire flight never existed? That she hadn't nursed Amara and Malik? Hadn't shared her trauma? Hadn't looked at him with those raw, broken eyes? He shook her hand mechanically, feeling the smooth skin, the firm grip. Professional. Distant. Wrong. "Thank you for having me," he heard himself say. "Of course. Please. Let's go to the conference room." Catherine gestured toward the glass door, her movements precise, controlled. "I've been looking forward to this interview. Looking forward to it. Like it was just another meeting. Like James was just another candidate." His hands were shaking harder now. Malik started fussing, sensing his father's distress. And suddenly, James felt it all crashing down. The exhaustion, the confusion, the growing certainty that he'd been played. That everything on that plane had been a test, some elaborate CEO game to see how the desperate black father would react to charity from a wealthy white woman. Catherine held open the conference room door, waiting for him to enter. Her face remained perfectly neutral, but James caught something in her eyes. A warning, maybe, or a plea. He couldn't tell which. "After you, Mr. Norris," she said. And James realized with cold, sinking dread that he was about to sit across from this woman and pretend to be qualified, pretend to be professional, pretend that his entire life wasn't about to be decided by someone who'd seen him at his most vulnerable and desperate. Someone who might have been calculating this exact moment from the second she stood up in first class. The glass conference room felt like a fishbowl. Transparent walls offering no privacy, no escape from the curious eyes of employees passing in the hallway. James sat across from Catherine, Malik and Amara mercifully asleep against his chest, and felt something inside him crack wide open. "Was this all part of your process?" His voice came out louder than he intended, sharp enough that a woman walking past glanced through the glass. "Some white savior test? You gonna tell your board about rescuing the struggling black dad on the plane? Put it in your diversity report?" Catherine sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, her blue eyes steady on his face. She didn't flinch, didn't defend herself, didn't speak. Just let him burn. "You knew," James continued, his hands trembling against Malik's back. "You knew who I was the whole time. Did you plan it? Sit in coach on purpose? Wait for the desperate black man with crying babies so you could swoop in and play savior? Are you finished?" Catherine's voice was quiet, but it cut through his anger like a blade. James's jaw clenched. "Yeah, I'm finished." Catherine reached beside her chair and lifted a manila folder onto the table. She slid it across to him with deliberate care, her movements precise and unhurried. "Open it!" James stared at the folder like it might contain a bomb. With one hand, the other still supporting Malik, he flipped it open. Personnel file. His name across the top. Request date. March 15th. 3 weeks before their flight. His eyes scanned down. Performance reviews from his previous supervisor. Attendance records showing 3 years of perfect punctuality. Efficiency metrics proving he'd increased warehouse productivity by 40%. Reference letters that made his throat tight. Beneath that, a second document. Job offer letter. Salary, $85,000. Benefits, comprehensive. Childcare stipend included. Date, March 20th. 4 days before he even knew his mother would be hospitalized. A full week before he booked that red-eye flight. "I don't lie, James." Catherine's voice was steady, but he heard something raw underneath it. "You earned this position on your record. 3 years perfect attendance. 40% efficiency increase. Glowing references from people who said you were the best supervisor they ever worked for." James couldn't breathe. The words on the page blurred. "What happened on that plane?" Catherine leaned forward, and for the first time since she'd walked into this building, he saw the woman from the flight. The one with tears on her face. The one who'd held his babies like they were precious. That wasn't charity, James. That was grace. Unplanned, uncomfortable, necessary, for both of us. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, Catherine stood. "The job is yours if you want it. Take your time. Think about it." She walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "But answer me one question first. If I'd been a black woman on that plane, would you be this angry?" The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving James alone with sleeping twins, a job offer he'd earned, and a truth he wasn't ready to face. James sat alone in the glass conference room for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. Amara and Malik slept peacefully against his chest, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. The contract lay open on the table in front of him. $85,000 annual salary, full health benefits, childcare stipend, start date flexible to accommodate his situation. Everything he needed. Everything he'd been praying for during those long nights when the eviction notices piled up and his mama's hospital bills kept coming and LaShawn's voice echoed in his head, telling him he'd never amount to anything. His phone buzzed. "Mama," calling from Grady Hospital. "Hey, Mama." His voice came out rough. "Baby." She sounded tired but stronger than yesterday. "How'd it go?" James looked at the contract, at Catherine's question still hanging in the air like smoke. "I don't know. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" He couldn't explain it. The plane, the nursing, the shock of seeing Catherine here, the anger that felt righteous until she'd shown him that folder with dates that proved she hadn't orchestrated anything. So he said nothing. "Let me tell you something," his mama said. And he heard that tone that meant she was about to drop wisdom, whether he wanted it or not. "Last night, I had a white nurse named Jennifer. She sat with me all night when I couldn't breathe right. She braided my hair, James. These old hands can't do it no more. And she braided my whole head while we talked about her daughter and my grandbabies. Then she prayed with me. A white woman from somewhere up north, praying over a black woman from Adamsville like we were sisters. James felt his throat tighten. Baby, sometimes God sends help that don't look like we expect. Your pride is your daddy talking, and he ain't here. He walked away because he was too proud to accept love when it was messy and complicated and didn't look how he thought it should. Her voice cracked. Don't be him, James. Don't be so proud you miss your blessing. The call ended. James sat there, his mama's words settling into his chest like stones. Or maybe like truth. He found Catherine in the parking garage 20 minutes later, leaning against a silver Mercedes, her CEO armor finally cracked. She looked exhausted. Human. I'm sorry, James said, and the words cost him something. I thought you were trying to save me. Catherine looked at him for a long moment and then smiled. Sad, knowing, tired. I was just being human, James. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. He pulled the signed contract from his pocket and held it out. Catherine took it, glanced at his signature, and nodded once. Welcome to Meridian Logistics. James felt it then, small and fragile and terrifying, something he hadn't let himself feel in months. Hope. 6 months later, James would stand in that same parking garage holding Amara and Malik, now babbling one-year-olds who called Catherine Calf-Win, and realize that accepting help hadn't made him weak. It had made him whole. That grace, real grace, doesn't care about your pride or your history or the color of anyone's skin. It just shows up when you need it most, wearing pearl earrings and offering the most uncomfortable, necessary kindness you've ever received. But you'll never know how that moment changed everything unless you hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is the story nobody wants you to hear. The one about a black father and a white woman who broke every rule we're taught about who gets to help who gets to be vulnerable, who gets to need saving. And if you scroll past this without subscribing, you're telling YouTube that stories like James's don't matter, that single fathers struggling in silence should stay invisible, that the most radical act of love you'll ever witness, two strangers becoming family on a red-eye flight, isn't worth 3 seconds of your time. So subscribe, share this. Because somewhere right now, there's a James on a plane, drowning in shame, waiting for someone to remind him that accepting help isn't weakness. It's wisdom, and he needs to hear this story. Don't let him miss it.